Coming up on today's episode,
I think all stories really are negotiated truths, but I think especially post-traumatic stories have all those extra layers of psychological and memory disruption, which are further areas of negotiation.
Welcome to the Voix podcast series on disquieting voices. Today, we're asking, how can writing help us to live with trauma? How can we think about writing, not as a way to report trauma, but as a practice that transforms the mark of pain into something else?
In today's episode, we are joined by Professor Meg Jensen. Her pioneering work in trauma narrative therapy seamlessly bridges the realms of literature, psychology, neurobiology, and human rights. Together, we'll dive into how writing can transform from mere documentation into a profound space of negotiation, a means of living with pain rather than simply recording it. Hello there, Meg. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
Meg, just to start us off, could you tell us a bit about your background and how you came to be interested in your area of work?
Sure. I suppose kind of funny combination of education, experience, opportunities, but also closed doors. I've always been interested in the stories that we tell about ourselves. And the stories we tell about our families and each other. I'm one of 6 children, so from a big Irish Catholic family in New York. And for us, storytelling has always been a kind of battleground of different memories of brothers and sisters arguing about what happened when, what the real truth was, what actually occurred. So I think I grew up always with this idea of the contested memory and contested storytelling. But as I said, I was born in New York. I did my undergraduate degree there, and then I came to the UK to do my PhD in English literature. I was focused mainly on modernist life writing, so sort of Virginia Woolf, Catherine Mansfield. But I've always been interested in true stories in life writing. Even as a kid, I preferred things like Little House on the Prairie to traditional fairy tales. I was always interested in true stories. And I'm now Professor Emeritus of Creative Writing and English Literature at Kingston University. And the focus of my research continues to be kind of the work of the autobiographical, how it can be used and useful, particularly in post-trauma and post-conflict settings. So I develop and design projects in collaboration with local experts in post-conflict regions or with underserved communities to develop expressive storytelling methods that can be useful to support community growth, but also individual recovery, particularly in kind of post-traumatic settings.
Thank you so much, Meg. That really helps us understand your perspective. As I listen, I'm struck by how your intellectual journey often grapples with themes of responsibility, limits, and the representation of violence. In trauma studies, there's a long-standing assumption that literature should bear witness, generate empathy, or make harm intelligible. Do you find yourself questioning that assumption? And if so, when did that uneasiness about the representation of violence first emerge for you? Maybe in your teaching or reading?
It's a very good question, for which I have a story to tell you. So when I was 10 years old, 2 very bad but unrelated things happened to me. First of all was the sudden death of a sibling, and the second was violent sexual assault. The first of these, my eldest brother's sudden death in a car accident, was obviously shocking, tragic, upsetting for the family. But as the years passed, I began to see that that loss began to heal. So as the years passed, that loss began to heal. Now, obviously, it's decades later. And there's a very different feeling around that loss of my brother than there was in the beginning. However, my other experience, the assault, that feeling and that memory did not heal over time. So for years and years, I sought help with various therapists and things, everything from, meditation, yoga, therapy, for anxiety, periodic depression, and self-destructive, unhealthy behavior. Over time, I was taught that the reason for my two very different reactions to those two terrible things was that in the case of my brother's death, that was something I was able to openly talk about and share with other people. Um, and in that way to learn to grieve and to lessen my suffering. But somehow, apparently, the attack about which I could not speak, and I had huge amount of, shame and guilt and fear and all those things, continued to haunt me. So I took my therapist's advice and spoke. And again, I tried to talk about what happened. But whenever I did, the words and the phrasing seemed to kind of fall apart in my hands. And I can liken it really mostly to if you try to tell someone about a dream that you've had. It can be very clear in your mind exactly what happened in that dream, but as you try to relate it, you understand that it's not making any sense. The images could be very clear and strong to you, but there's no narrative, no clear narrative arc. There's no context for all these different things that are happening in the dream state. And traumatic memory is very much like that. And as a result of that, while I was telling these stories in the hope that it would make me feel better, often I would contradict myself. My therapist would say, "But that's not what you said last time. Are you sure that's what happened?" And of course, for a survivor, a victim, the idea of having your story questioned is hugely can be a further traumatization. So that in the act of trying to lessen one's pain and grief, it's very easy to become re-traumatized rather. That the sharing of the story can re-traumatize the victim. So now, having said all that, that is the kind of personal connection that I felt to this kind of writing. But it came into my or this kind of storytelling, or ideas around trauma, memory, and storytelling. But professionally, in 2014, I was in the process of creating a program with a colleague for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, International Foreign and Commonwealth Office funded project. This was related to the FCO's international protocol on the documentation, investigation, and investigation of sexual violence in conflict. That was back in 2014. So I was reading through this documentation, thinking about, what kind of stories should we be telling? And I became actually really horrified by the processes and procedures that were listed for the interviewers, knowing that they would be talking to people who were victims of sexual violation in conflict. The section on interviewing and collecting testimony advises the interviewer that he or she should be sure to cover the who, what, where, when, and why. The who, what, where, when, and how of the crimes that have been committed. Do things like measure bruises, take photographs of injuries, to draw out timescales of when things happened. And they spend no time at all, they suggest no time at all be spent on the why of what happened. When I first read this documentation, it was as if these two different bits of my life kind of came crashing together. My personal struggle that I've been dealing with my whole life, about how to tell the story, about how to heal through trauma, and then suddenly seeing this documentation saying this is how we should deal with trauma and trauma stories. So really, that was the beginning of me saying there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way to document stories in such a way, document crimes, indeed, in such a way as to help rather than re-traumatize their survivor. So that since that time, so that was back in 2014, but since that time, I've developed and designed and co-designed with local experts dozens of interventions that try to do precisely that, work with victims of violence um, in ways that they can tell what happened to them in such a way to support their healing rather than re-traumatize them.
Thanks so much, Meg, and thanks for sharing with us your personal experiences as well. And I think what you've outlined really gives a sense of the way that your own experience was brought together with your academic work. And we definitely want to come back to talk about the work that you were describing just then with survivors and with those that are tasked with responding, on the front line to people who've been victims of violence. But maybe if we can stay with the theme of trauma, because that came through a lot in what you were just saying there, and in contemporary discussion around trauma, it often gets treated as something that needs to be made visible to be addressed or needs to be brought out in some way. How do you explore trauma in your own work, and is it similar or different to this sort of view of making visible?
Mhm. I suppose the question is about being made visible to whom. Um, so I think the most important work for me of autobiographical writing of any kind is to help elucidate my own experiences to myself um, rather than um, think about them as bearing witness in a larger sense. And that doesn't mean that they don't bear witness or that I have no interest in that. But I think the most important thing, because the most potentially healing thing, I think, is to explore and elucidate the experience of myself. And I do think this is obviously the work of a lifetime. The very nature of traumatic memory is such that I may never have a fully clear, understanding of exactly what happened. All I will have is lots of different points of view, um, but that's important.
Meg, on that note about visibility, during COVID, we have observed a notable rise in autobiography writing or memoirs, whether shared by victims of sexual violence or indeed others. We are curious what led you to focus on autobiography. Might you elaborate on how autobiography is generally understood and how it differs from other forms of writing?
Yeah, sure. So I think, as I said earlier, I'm very interested in the work of autobiography, and I think that's what makes it different from other forms or one of the things that makes it different from other forms of writing, in the ways that storytelling, self storytelling, helps us to interrogate and interpret life experience. Um, in a kind of attempt to tease out that why that I was talking about. The question that most survivors want answered is, why did this happen to me? And that's almost always necessarily an unanswerable question. The answer could be that you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but even that's not really an answer. Is it because you're, cursed by God? For some people, that may feel like an answer, but always that nagging sense of why. And there can be no answer. It's an act of violence. There's no full answer to that question. But the process of autobiography, I think, uniquely allows us to interrogate our own experiences um, in a way that's safe because it's on the page or it's at a distance from us. Um, and on the one hand, and then also enables us to set very careful ethical boundaries. I'm very, very concerned always with the both the ethics and the aesthetics of the ways that storytellers explore their past and the past of those around them. Always wondering, on whose behalf are they speaking? Again, partially this goes back to my, big family upbringing. Um, for me to tell a story of my own childhood necessarily contains aspects of the childhoods of multiple other people living in the same house as I did. And of course, their story of our childhood would be very different from mine. Um, so I'm always very aware of that. And something about autobiography enables me to concentrate or sort of, change the focus and make it more clearly, on this person or this person or this moment or that moment. Um, I don't think it's possible to write the truth. But I think what we can do is, kind of leap towards the truth, stumble as best we can towards a truth or multiple truths. Um, my research explores political questions of power, of community and speech, responsibility, how people form identities in relation to their own storytelling, their self storytelling. For understanding, and I think these are important in understanding the nature of post traumatic memory formation. So I think autobiography also helps me to think about why we remember and why we forget. What are the things that we are remembering and forgetting? So I'm not sure if that answer your question, but I think it's the complexity of autobiography that draws me. It's a way I can tell the same story over and over again throughout my life from different angles in order to try to make sense of that why um, or to stumble towards an answer to the why.
And maybe just staying with the complexity of autobiography for a moment. Obviously, there are different forms that autobiographical writing or telling can also take. So we can think about um, witness testimony as a form of autobiography, poetry, graphic memoir, also public memorial. As you said, it can be an individual storytelling. It can also be a group or a collective storytelling. Is there something that holds together these different forms for you? Is there something that sort of particularly draws them together as autobiographical? And are there forms that you think are more valuable than others?
I think the form finds the storyteller. Um, and, certainly, as you said, I consider a wide range of both, physical, virtual, concrete, um, autobiographical projects in my research, from sort of fiction to prison poems to um, you know uh, to memorials, concrete memorials, all these kinds of things. I think what all of them have in common is that in some way they manifest and also interrogate the altered relationship to the body, to memory, and to storytelling that is a result of traumatic injury. So, in different ways, these very different art forms are all navigating a difficult um, a abyss, a hole in the middle of the story, which is that why? Why did this happen? And so different kinds of artists may approach that and represent that through fragmentation of a narrative. So something that has what did Virginia Woolf called it, the complete story with missing parts. So, here is exactly what it looks like, but there will be some that it's always an interrogative aesthetic, that these are works that are asking questions rather than offering answers. So rather than, for example, a memorial, a concrete memorial, which shows, a soldier on horseback, clearly triumphant as a result of his participation in a certain battle or action or war, a post-traumatic counter memorial may show simply the names of the lost, right? So think about the Vietnam Memorial, famously in Washington, D.C., which is just the names of the lost on those concrete pillars. And what that's doing is it's, on the one hand, reminding us to remember this loss. On the other hand, it's offering no meaning for it. It's not imposing a political or moral or religious meaning upon that. So it's that kind of thing that I think of as post-traumatic autobiographical aesthetics. Some of the work that does, and obviously I'm very interested, in memoir, and memoir takes lots of often fragmentary forms, or things that are written from the backwards, like Stuart A Life Backwards. Those kinds of stories which are playing around with form. I'm interested in that, but also I think one of the most interesting forms, possibly because I didn't know as much about it, and so it's more new to me than other forms, is graphic memoirs, or sort of comics that use comic style or comic book style, and something about often the images just in black and white, the childishness, the limitation of the focus in each image, the way in which it's clear that so much is being left out. Comics make that explicit. That clearly there are spaces between these boxes. There are places that are not connected. And I think there's something about that form that I think is particularly well suited to the telling of trauma stories. As we see, it's been used, all over the place for all different kinds of memoir and autobiographical writing. But I have no no talent as an artist or a cartoonist. So for me, I'm sticking to kind of auto-theoretical work instead. But I know we'll come back and talk about that later.
Many people assume that writing is therapeutic, but you've written about its double-edged nature. It can both heal and reopen wounds. In your work with writers emerging from conflict or familiar trauma, how do you navigate that tension between writing as a form of healing and its potential to cause harm?
It's a good question. I think of writing. There's a famous Ernest Hemingway quotation saying, writing is easy. You just have to sit down at the typewriter and bleed. And I think for people who are writing anything that's recalling difficult past experiences, we can understand perhaps what he meant by that. And I think, kind of like blood itself, the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, offer evidence of a rich and complex life. But if that blood is spilling forth, it can be dangerous and harmful. So, that same symbol of blood can be, a life-giving thing, but also a warning. And I think the meaning depends on the context rather than the content. The same kind of story can be told in different ways. In the last couple of decades, a lot of work has been done by psychologists and especially narrative therapists that can consider the relationship between narrative, the experience of a trauma event, and the way that trauma may be represented in a story. So the kind of science that comes between the disruption of normal memory processes, and then how those memories may be retold and represented. A very famous psychologist by the name of James Pennebaker developed a theory, which he then went on to prove, which is around how certain forms of writing, what he called writing therapy, and now we call expressive writing, may be helpful to people in attempting to heal from past traumatic experience. So that back in 1998 is when he first brought out this project, which very famously said, writing helps to heal. And we now have evidence that writing helps to heal. However, he then had to go on to say, but we have no reason, um, we have no evidence of why this happens. So all we know is that writing helped these people, but we don't yet know why. So then the next 20 years of research went into looking at why it might be that writing and more widely storytelling could be useful in helping with trauma, supporting people post-trauma. So another very well-known researcher, Celia Hunt, at Sussex University, went on and did further work with her own students who were doing life writing courses. And what she discovered is that there's something about the process of expressing emotion in your writing that allows us to become unstuck from certain difficult memories that we tend to cling on to. So, in other words, traumatic memories, we can push ourselves away from them just enough to be able to detach and heal through the process, as she put it, of writing imaginatively. So not so much writing about the traumatic event over and over again, but just writing and expressing emotion more generally. So I tend to think about the works of both those writers. And then also, I have a background in science. My undergraduate years, I did kind of joint degree in natural sciences and writing. So I like very much reading lots about science and incorporating that into my own research. So what I've tried to do is to understand what is it that causes, what is it chemically, neurologically, psychologically, that causes these moments of fragmentation and this kind of language of limited perception and so forth that we see in many post-traumatic bits of writing and autobiographical projects more generally.
And I think it's really interesting to be coming at it from both a science and a humanities and arts perspective, because I think so often those two perspectives get polarized, especially when it comes to healthcare and to therapy as well. So I think to explore that space where the two can mutually sort of inform each other and maybe have productive tension between them as well. It's really interesting. I was going to ask about whether you could say more about the ways that writing can be good for us and hurt in this way.
So if the helpful part of it is, as I said, this potential for becoming unstuck, being able to detach emotionally, so that the story becomes somewhat less central to your identity, and instead can become something that is outside of yourself. It's on a sheet of paper, or it's in this painting on the wall, or it's in this dance that I've created, or poem that I've written. But one of the more difficult and potentially harmful issues with storytelling, post-trauma storytelling, can happen especially within groups. So there's something that we call a trauma carrier group, and that is a group that can form post-disaster, post-conflict. It used to be rarer and would happen only in a community, let's say when a hurricane hit and then everyone in the community came together to share their stories of the hurricane and how terrible it was for them and people they have lost and that kind of thing. Now, obviously, these things happen all the time online, so there's much greater um, number of groups to which an individual may feel that they are connected. So, in other words, if a community, if we think of something like the Me Too movement, right, where we have lots of people coming online to share these, some just to say, "Me too, this happened to me," other people to actually share their trauma stories. And while on the one hand, it seems as if that could be a good and useful thing to do, um, for many people, once they join a group, especially people who have felt that they haven't been heard before, which is often the case with someone who's a victim of sexual violence. Um, they have been afraid to talk or felt like when they told their story, they weren't believed or thought, told they were exaggerating or whatever it was. So when that person then joins a powerful, larger group of individuals, it can be supportive, right? But also, it can help to cement one's identity as a victim. So, in other words, the more you engage with that platform or that group or go on marches or whatever, this identity, this traumatic experience of yours becomes a central pole, let's say, in the structure of your identity. What most storytelling narrative therapies attempt to do, by contrast, is in different ways, using different approaches, to help the survivor understand their traumatic injuries, the traumatic event or events that happened to them, as simply one in a series of events that have happened over the course of their lives, where they have had good things happen to them and bad things. So they have had weddings and they've had funerals. They've had, children being born and people passing away. And that the traumatic event, like those other events, is one, an important one, but just one in a series of life events. That none of these life events are all of you. So, the passing of an individual person is not everything, is not all of you, if that makes sense. So that's the difficulty with this. The formation of what we call these trauma carrier groups can be, for some people who maybe don't have other kinds of support, who aren't engaged in any kind of psychological therapeutic help for their past experience, it may kind of consolidate this sense of who I am is a victim. And I think there are much more helpful stories to tell oneself. Although, of course, it makes sense, and I do understand why people would want to find a community who shares their experience. But actually, often the experiences are not as similar as they may seem to be. People may feel like they need to kind of shoehorn themselves in, but I mean, that's another story. But yeah, so that's the other difficulty, is the idea that this can become the whole of one's story.
I think that's so interesting, and also brings up a point we wanted to ask you about, the idea of voice. There is obviously, in discussions of sexual violence and of responses to violence against women, there is a lot of emphasis placed on this idea of the voice, of having one's own voice, or sharing a voice. And obviously, this is important, and has previously not been recognised or taken into account, women's voices within responses to these to instances of violence. But in what ways do does your work on writing a narrative connect with this focus on voice, and other ways that you see what you're interested in with writing as sort of working not against that idea of voice, but in maybe in another direction?
Well, I think survivors, if we're talking about trauma stories and trauma storytelling, survivors do, I think, use almost sort of every possible form of communication that they can. In that, there's something about one of the real difficulties in trauma is the contradictory compulsion both to be heard, to tell your story on the one hand, and also to remain silent. That they're both those contradictory pressures. I think stories are powerful, and there are no stories that are more powerful than the ones that we tell ourselves. And I think that really is the central bit around speech and voice that I'm concerned with is what is the voice in our own head? Um, what am I saying to myself on a daily basis? On a moment to moment basis? Am I constantly critiquing myself and saying, "Oh, that was stupid. Don't do that. Oh, you you look wrinkly. You're what are all different kinds of things that we can constantly criticize ourselves. Or am I able to think about this, to be curious about the stories that I tell myself and say, where does that come from? Whose voice is that? So, in addition, I guess what I'm saying is, in addition to the idea of women's voices speaking out loud, I think it's very important for us to be curious about the voices in our own heads. So even before we worry about our story being shared outwards, or other people hearing from us or sharing our experiences, I think probably the most important work we can do initially is to take note of the stories we're telling ourselves and be sure and think about how they serve us. So probably the most important question, if we're thinking about voice and how voices, particularly underrepresented voices, women's voices, can and should be heard, I suppose what I'm thinking always is that I want to first investigate what those voices inside my head are telling me before I share them with other people. So that first and foremost, my question is around what are the voices and are the stories I'm telling myself about myself on a day-to-day basis? Am I telling myself I am a strong person who's resilient and capable? Um, and those kinds of stories that in the worst times of my life, I have been able to find the strength to keep going. I mean, that's a hugely powerful story that I think maybe most of us don't tell ourselves enough. And so by changing the stories, or at least being aware of both the positive and negative stories we tell ourselves, I think that can have a huge cultural and social change, because then when we do speak out, we are speaking from a voice of self-compassion, of curiosity, and awareness that hopefully can be of help to other people. Um, yeah, I suppose so. That to me, the internal voice is the most important voice, and the one we can do the most about, I think. Um, yeah, in our study and analysis.
I've been reflecting on Lavinia from Shakespeare's play Titus Andronicus, who's left unable to speak or use her hands, yet she finds a way to inscribe her trauma from the vivid image of a stick in her mouth. by etching into the sand. Taking this imagery forward, how does her method of recording trauma compare to the ways contemporary memoirs do it? And what does this comparison reveal about why survivors might choose writing over speaking?
I like that. I like that analogy, and I think that, or allegory. I think it's important to remember that, or what that story is telling us is that thing about the compulsion of the victim to tell, right? The need for the survivor to share that story, no matter the nearly impossible and often conflicting pressures upon that trauma storytelling. Lee Gilmore, who I know is going to be coming to your conference, is a good friend of mine, has written obviously extensively about the ways in which trauma narrative offers or interrogates and tests the limits of the form of autobiography. So it pushes against the memoir form as it tries to tell these, in some way, untellable stories. Um, she says that the person who has suffered harm and performs a first person representation about their injury, so someone who's bearing witness to that injury, that person, she says, is tasked with more than bearing witness to it. And I think that more, what is the more? What is the pressure that is on that storytelling? Are both internal and external. They, I write quite a bit about this in the art and science of trauma, and the autobiographical. But just simply put, there are three categories with multiple subcategories, but three categories of pressures that are on the person bearing witness. And that can be memory effects. So the ways in which traumatic injury disrupts normal memory creation. So if there's a difficulty sharing that memory or turning that memory into a story. The second kind of pressure that is on the person telling a story or bearing witness is what I think of as dialogue effects. So when you've decided now, first you were thinking about how can you construct this memory into a story in your own mind to tell yourself. The second thing you may wish to do is tell it to another person. But then, of course, that brings in the pressures around what that person may say in response to your storytelling. Will you be believed? Will you be questioned? How will you react emotionally? Will this be difficult for you to say? Will you have to stop somehow in the middle? On top of which, you always also have the emotional response to that memory coming up again. So that's the second kind of series of pressures on a person who wants to share their story. And finally, I think about probably many of us are very familiar with the trauma story that becomes a human rights story. So if we think about, a poster of a starving child asking us for money, or the story that may be told to us about a woman who has to walk 10 miles to gather water, and we hear these stories, and these are all by way of raising awareness, and possibly also raising money, advocacy of some kind for human rights violations or losses in different ways. So there are those kinds of audiences that someone may wish to share their story with to raise awareness and recognition. But there may also be another kind of pressure that comes along with that in how that story needs to be edited. From what position will that story be told? What will the reaction be? Will people have kind of compassion fatigue and no longer care about the story of what happened to you. Also, again, in that way that I was talking about earlier, telling your story in this way may, again, reinforce this idea of your identity as a survivor. So I think the pressures on the storytelling are such that those, in addition to the emotional and psychological risk of those stories, sh- um, show up or are manifested in post-traumatic memorial projects of all kinds. I think they show up in the in the gaps and the spaces in the black granite of the Vietnam War Memorial on the one hand, and in the spaces between, or the black pages that we see in some graphic memoirs, which will feature just a single black page or blank page representing loss, or again, in the form and often counter narrative form that's used in many autobiographical, um, post autobiographical writing, literature, and poetry of many kinds. So I think the relationship between the teller, the person, the survivor, and the teller, even if they are the same person, it needs to be understood as a series of dynamic pressures on the mind and the body and the social and psychological space in which the story is being told. Um, and an awareness of those pressures is often contradictory. So the pressure to tell and not to tell, to remember and to forget, which would be a much more pleasant thing to be able to do. And, I think about that being summed up in a different Shakespearean quotation: to be or not to be. That is the question. I think that that's all in there. This idea of those contradictory pressures, both are, compounded on the survivor trying to tell the story of their life.
Can I just follow up a bit on the idea of the story and the narrative, and the constraints that a focus on narrative and storytelling might bring itself? I think if we consider, I suppose, a fairly straightforward idea of storytelling, you've got a kind of beginning and end, you're telling a sort of linear narrative. Um, with that, do you see that as somehow placing constraints on the possibilities of expression and expressing trauma? Or are there ways in which the sorts of things that you've looked at in relation to trauma and storytelling is itself opening new possibilities for that form and challenging those easy assumptions around linearity narrative?
Mm, mm, mm. Well, I think definitely the nature of trauma and trauma memory is both privative in that sense of that each, although you may have very strong sense memories um, of sights, sounds, feelings during the event, often they are out of context and out of time, so they don't appear with any kind of logical narrative coherence, or are very difficult to shape into that. And I think that's both, obviously a privative dynamic, but a generative one as well. And I think, obviously some of our finest works of art come out of that need to tell the story, but tell it slant, as Emily Dickinson put it, to the very need to come at it from another direction, allows things like an unreliable narrator, and the invention of this kind of character. I think about in Woolf's To the Lighthouse, she has a three-part form in the telling of this very autobiographical, traumatic story of her childhood and her mother's death, in the center of which is a section simply called "Time Passes." Um, which seems to have nothing to do with the rest of the story until you begin to, you see that actually what she's trying to do is, like the spaces between two two squares on a comic book page. She's trying to show that there's something happens, but I can't tell you about that part. I'm trying to create the space between these two different concrete things that I can tell you about. And I mentioned earlier about Stuart, A Life Backwards by Alexander Masters, telling the life in backwards form. And also Julia Alvarez, in The Time of Butterflies, is another book that has multiple different narrators that jump back in time and space. And all of these kinds of innovative breakthrough forms of writing, and that's just the writing. I mean, there's also the monuments. There's a series of monuments in Berlin to the Holocaust, the Solperstein project, which involves small brass plaques being put into the street in places where there were victims of the Holocaust have died in those places. And the idea is, and the word Solperstein is to tumble over, trip over. And the idea is that as you walk down the street, you will trip over, and that will cause you to remember. And it goes back to an old kind of myth that when you trip in the street, it's because you're stepping over a place where someone has passed away. So it uses this kind of cultural myth to create a concrete, but highly dispersed monument that's all over the city, so you don't know where you'll come upon it. So those kinds of innovative approaches to memory and storytelling, I think, are the gift of trauma. Whether anybody who has suffered traumatic injury would rather be a less good storyteller and have not had the thing happen to them, I think they would probably all say yes. But I think that is where innovation often comes from. Is through that. You close one door and a window opens, or whatever they say. That the inability to tell the narrative with the beginning and middle and an end, at the same time as having the compulsion to tell the narrative, means that necessarily a new form must arise.
In your book, The Art and Science of Trauma and the Autobiographical, you describe trauma writing as negotiated rather than confessed or reported, which is a unique way of thinking about autobiography writing. Could you start by explaining what you mean by negotiation in this context?
So the term comes about from an essay that I read by the novelist J.G. Ballard. So J.G. Ballard is very famous for writing lots of different science fiction works, but probably his most famous work is based on his own childhood experience, The Empire of the Sun, which is based around his experience as a child who is imprisoned in a Japanese war camp in World War II. And I read an article about that J.G. Ballard had written about the writing of that book, and in it he talks about how he found it very difficult to write about his childhood until he decided that the only way really to do it was to drop his parents from the story, so that in the novel he leaves Jim, who is the young J.G. Ballard, as completely abandoned. He has no family to look after him in the prison camp. And Ballard says that in doing this, he suddenly felt that he was free to write whatever it is he wanted. And that, and looking back, thinking about whether he should be calling this a novel or a memoir, he decided that he wouldn't call it either thing. That by removing his parents from the story, it actually was a kind of emotional truth, because in real life, although his parents were in the prison camp with him, they weren't really there for him. So the emotional truth of his childhood was that he was abandoned in this place, even if the actual physical truth was that his parents were there. And this also allowed him, obviously, the ethical space to not have to say much about his parents. Really, what he wanted to talk about was how it was for him. So within all this, he says, having written this book with those significant changes, he thought that enough of it was based on fact to convince me that what had seemed like a dreamlike pageant was in fact a negotiated truth. And I've always loved that terminology, that ultimately I don't know how else any of us tells the story of our lives, whether we've had traumatic experiences or not. I think it's always a negotiated truth based on those pressures I was talking about earlier. First of all, what do we remember and how do we construct that story to tell ourselves? How do we then think about how we tell certain individuals? Obviously, I would tell a story to a friend very differently than I might to my colleague, very differently than I might to my child, right? So that's that kind of dialogue pressure I was talking about. And obviously, if we want to go so far as to publish something, there's another level of audience expectation um, and needs that we would need to bear in mind. So I think all stories really are negotiated truths, but I think especially post-traumatic stories have all those extra layers of psychological and memory disruption, which are further areas of negotiation. So that's what I mean when I say negotiated truths.
Just to follow up what you just said then, Meg, does that negotiation ever feel like a second labor on top of the original wound?
I think it always does, yes. Even this morning, knowing that I had to come and talk a bit about something in my own past, the need to tell that story again and again in my writing and also just in my research and scholarship is always a further labor. So it's a matter of um, navigating and I guess negotiating for myself. When is it worth telling that story? And when is it not worth? But it's always an emotional labor, yeah.
And I think the idea of negotiation there, it also seems to go back to what we were talking about at the start of the podcast when you were mentioning about your experiences with practitioners and the practical side of the work that you've done. Do you see the idea of negotiation as challenging certain ideas that might be prevalent within particular domains where we're simply documenting the facts of what has happened when we're asking people to testify or to recount their traumatic experiences?
I'm interested in the um, potential for recovery and healing for the individual or the small group that I may be working with. That does not mean that a fight for justice might not be important to them. Um, but I suppose I also feel that um, the chances for most of the people that I work with, the chances of any of them really achieving justice in a court of law are minuscule. As we know, the prosecution rate for women who are victims of rape is less than 1% in the UK. So how much less so when those things are also incorporated with acts of war and states and that kind of thing. So that does not mean that I think those things should not be recorded, but I think our first duty must be to the individual survivor. There may be some people who are strong enough to tell their story over and over again. Not everyone who undergoes a traumatic experience becomes traumatized. About 25% of people do become traumatized after a traumatic event. It's likely from some kind of genetic um, uh, genetic inherited quality that some people are more prone to developing PTSD and other traumatic disorders than others. So it may be that there are people who could be interviewed um, and and have that done successfully and have a crime be documented, but there are 25% of people in the room will be re-traumatized by telling that trauma story. And I think there should be much clearer triage and training for people to be able to triage and see the differences between those two people, and for the ways in which the questions are devised. And that's something that I've worked on with colleagues, to be able to incorporate some of this um, expressive storytelling rather than simply having to go through the who, what, where, when, and how, um, that we were talking about earlier.
So if we move then to think about your own practice a bit more, perhaps this would be a good time to think about that. And if you're in a room with others, helping them to write about their trauma and their experience, not in theoretical terms, but in practical terms, in terms of lived experience, what sort of things would you ask them to do first? Would it be to find a memory, or find voice, or find distance? Could you talk us through a bit about the practice?
Yeah, so normally, with these projects, often they will be a funded project, and funding may come from the UNDP or UNHCR or the AHRC or any other kind of funding organization. And what will happen is that we will put together a potential program with people who are experts, either in country or experts in that community, usually social workers, that kind of thing, charity workers, human rights workers, or a combination of all of those. Um, and the very first thing we do is a needs assessment. So we would begin by saying, "Hey, here's some of the work we've done before. Here are the kinds of things we've done. Here are the questions that we have asked and the exercises we've done. Please give us your informed feedback about how that would work in your context, whether it would, and any suggestions you have." So as a result of that, we may then go on to decide, okay, in this community, it's best to do this one-to-one, or to talk with people, on the phone, rather than face to face. Or in this group, they already have a community of women who meet once a week to talk about to do cooking, or to talk about children, or whatever. We will tag this on to the end of that women's group time, for anyone who's interested in participating. So it always begins with a very kind of structured needs base. So we're not just going in and saying, "Here's what you need." We're saying there are multiple approaches that could be taken, and we want to be directed by the local experts before deciding which way we take. But now, having said all that, we normally begin very slowly. We never ask anyone to disclose. The object of this is not at all to have anyone share the worst thing that ever happened with them in a group of people. Actually, the people normally, the participants, aren't really interested in that kind of storytelling. What they want to talk about is what happens next. How do they move um, beyond what's happened to be a better mother to their children who are struggling, or to be a better wife to the husband who hasn't been able to have a job for a very long time. Those are the kinds of things that tend to be spoken about. And again, as you can see, in terms of that self-storytelling, that makes for much healthier and stronger storytelling for us to be able to um, talk about what we're going to do in the future. Suggests that there is a future. And that's very, very important, for people who are survivors of trauma, to be able to see past the terrible thing that had happened to them, to see a potential future. So often we'll begin, usually, as I've said, we've delivered this in lots of different ways. It's done online, virtually, during COVID, that kind of thing. But in general, we tend to work with small groups of women, 10, 15 women. It's not always women, but it has been the funding we've received so far. We have done some work with young men, but mainly we've worked with women. They also tend to be more interested and wish to participate more in these kind of psychosocial things, generally speaking. But we would get together a group of people, and we might begin with a really short icebreaker, like tell one another, sit in a group, sit in pairs, and tell one another the story of your name. Now, the idea of the story of your name, so if my name is Meg, but why is it Meg? Is it really Meg? It's actually Margaret, and why do I call myself Meg? So that kind of simple storytelling first gets people primed to tell stories about themselves. But also it's a kind of low stakes for most people. It rarely raises very strong emotions. Some people have no particular story why they have that name. But often it allows for a little personal storytelling that this was the name of my grandmother or, you know, whatever the story might be. So we start with very small steps like that. We might move on then to either ask them to then tell the group what they've just told, the story of their name, um, or we might have them take turns to tell each other's stories. So if I was paired with you, I might tell the name of your story, Emma, and you would tell mine. And these are just different ways of getting the group dynamic, people to talk to one another. Also, when you tell the story of your name, people tend to remember your name, which is obviously very useful in later group work. Then, and a very important part of that very first interaction would be to talk about how did it feel to tell that story? How did it feel to speak up in front of this group? And again, this is all the very initial thing that I guess any good facilitator would do to try to gauge participation in the room, to see is everybody willing to share, or there's some people who aren't, just to kind of take the temperature of what's going on in the room and how bold they may be emotionally or not. You may have a very timid group of people who don't wish to, say hardly anything. So from that, the facilitator will decide what are the second level of storytelling exercises we will do. So based on that initial kind of temperature check of the room. And generally speaking, we ask people, they certainly can write, but usually what we say is you can write or mark down in any way, you can draw a picture of something, and in any language that you prefer. Or you can tell us. So usually if they're going to tell us, they'll begin with some kind of images and then use those as prompts to tell. And normally we would ask for something that has nothing to do with any specific traumatic experience. It might just be, tell me about a recent family event that that you enjoyed. And then we might go on to say a recent family event that you did not enjoy. So we very slowly there are a number of steps sort of psychologically that have been mapped out for us to take. But the idea is, in the end, more than anything else, more than them telling the stories to us, it is much more, as I was saying earlier, about them gaining some curiosity about the stories they're telling themselves, about themselves and about their experiences. And eventually, the goal of the expressive writing is what I was talking about earlier, being able to see this terrible event or events as one of a series of events in your life. So, another question we may ask is, tell a story of something you did that you were very proud of, for example. And it doesn't have to relate to any specific moment. So we don't push anybody to disclose. And people sometimes they prefer to do that one-to-one. And that's very different. And, I'm not a therapist, and what we're trying to do is something slightly different. And what tends to happen at the end of these projects is not that we have a collection of stories of terrible events that have happened to people, but is that we've developed a community of practice of people who are happy to work together to share experience, and through that to build trust, intimacy, which allows for things outside the individual and allows for people to feel that they can trust the social workers in other aspects of their lives, that it trusts social workers to tell them, for example, in COVID, it was very useful, the people who had been working with us in the workshops were much more ready to go and have a vaccine, and to wear masks and that kind of stuff, just because they felt that connection to the community and to the social workers. So there's lots of different levels of what happens, but it's much less about the stories themselves than about the building of community and trust and the curiosity of listening to your own self stories.
And how do you resist that flattering effect of commercial trauma memoir templates while also keeping alive the practicalities of each stories?
Well, I think there are two very different needs and purposes to address. And firstly, I think, as I was saying, in my work, we're looking at the stories we're telling ourselves as a way of supporting healing. So understanding the events um, of difficulty, suffering, and trauma is just one part of the individual's life story. Um, so instead of asking them to talk about the worst thing or things that ever happened to them, um, we talk about potential futures. What may your life look like in 5 years, that kind of thing. Um, on the other hand, you have trauma memoirs, which are specifically created for public consumption. So it's a very different kind of product from what we do in the expressive writing programs. And that can be important for public advocacy, as I said before, for raising funds or for judicial processes. I think it rarely helps the individual telling the story, except potentially by maybe giving them money that they might need or a platform that they might wish to have. Um, I think as you said, these stories can be kind of shoehorned into bearable, listenable stories in which the audience is mainly interested in what the terrible thing that happened to the survivor, much less interested in the 40 years of life before that happened or the 30 years of life after that happened. Um, there's a psychologist, Henry Greenspan, who spent his whole career, about 40 years, interviewing and re-interviewing Holocaust survivors in his office, and he would meet with the same person once or twice a year for up to 30 years, talking to them about their experiences. And I talk about this in the book. There was one client, a guy called Abe, and Greenspan says that in various conversations over the years, Abe reflected on his role as a witness with stories to tell. So he was aware of himself as a person who was bearing witness and called upon to bear witness. Abe said that after decades of being asked to speak about his experiences of the Holocaust, there was one story that he told over and over again because it seemed to be an account that people could listen to. So even within his own storytelling, he had narrowed down and edited his life experience into certain stories that he knew would make sense with audiences. Another of Greenspan's long-term interviewees, called Leon, said something similar. He said, in the midst of trying to recount a really terrifying event to Greenspan, he stopped himself and he said, I can't tell you this because it's not a story. It has to be made in a story in order to convey it, but it's not a story. And I think it's very, very powerful idea to hold in mind when we're talking about trauma stories, that they're not stories. We have to make it into a story for you to hear it, but that's not how it is to me. Greenspan published a volume of these stories, and another of his clients said to him, that I'm glad you wrote the book, but whatever you put in the book, you must remember that what is not told is also true. What is not in the book is also true. And again, that's that thing I was talking about before, those lacuna, those spaces in between the frames on the page, or in the time passes section of To the Lighthouse, those spaces that can't be told are always part of the trauma story as well. The unsaid, the edited, the silenced voices are not only a stumbling block to understanding the truth of someone's traumatic experience, but they're actually direct evidence of that experience. They are trauma manifest. The holes in the story our trauma.
So we wanted to move to think about education and educational settings as well, Meg, in relation to the work that you do. The issue of violence against women and girls is becoming particularly predominant in school settings. And, as you probably have seen, the Labour government releasing this big cross governmental strategy around tackling violence against women, and education is sort of a central part of that. Just thinking about your own educational experiences, are there moments that you could think about from education that has shaped or marked how you think about or approach the issue in your own work?
Yes, not necessarily in a good way. I think I said I was from a big Irish Catholic family, so I went through 12 years of Catholic school. And although there are some strengths that I have found from being raised in a specific faith, or in a very faithful religious family, this particular religion offers only confession as a way to move forward. So a confession is the sole kind of road to forgiveness, to happiness. And of course, that model assumes that what one has to confess is one's own sin. So there is no story that I could tell that would be about someone else harming me. The only kind of place where I could have a voice would be in a confessional box, where I'd have to talk about what I had done wrong. So from the very beginning, if you think about violence towards women and violence towards women and girls, how that, or towards children more generally, how a child might understand that. So we had that, and then on the one hand, that idea of what help could I get, because obviously there weren't lots of things like therapists and psychologists in my younger years in my Catholic family. In school, also, we were given extremely limited role models of femininity. So on the one hand, we have the Virgin Mother, which is obviously something that none of us could hope to live up to. But again, often what were placed in front of us were models of saints, how saints had lived their lives, in particular how saints who had died young, or when they were children, had done some miraculous thing that enabled them to become sanctified. And two of those, one of them, Saint Bernadette of Lourdes. Saint Bernadette suffered and died an agonizing death after seeing these visions of the Virgin Mary. And of course, no one believed her, and they all just thought she was crazy. And then she was suffering terribly from tuberculosis of her whole body or something. And, and no one believed her. They thought she was exaggerating. It's only at the very, very end of her life that they begin to understand that no, she is dying. But the main lesson that we're taught from Saint Bernadette is that she suffers in silence. So, and that being a hugely, and sort of that's the reason that she becomes a saint. And then finally, really, there are multiple of these, but one story, again, a story I remember from my childhood around Saint Maria Goretti. So again, this is all in an educational setting. This is what we're learning in school, and we have statues of these people around us. So when Maria was 11, so around the same age I was when I was attacked, her 20-year-old neighbor was repeatedly kind of stalking her and attempting to, attack, to rape her. And after a number of times, she tried to pray with him, she tried to help him, all these different things that she did. This went on for months and months, till finally he said, either you let me do this or I will kill you. And he had a knife in his hand, and she said, I would rather be dead. So I would rather you kill me than for me to have this shame upon my life. And he killed her. On her deathbed, apparently she forgave him, and that's one of the miracles associated with her becoming a saint. So the main thing about her is that she is called the Great Virgin Martyr. That it was better for her to be dead than to submit to this sexual assault and presumably survive. These and other stories are incredibly powerful ones for young people, people of any age, but young people to be hearing, especially children who have perhaps had some of these experiences and don't know to whom they can turn. They may be nervous about talking to their parents. They're certainly not going to talk to their teachers if this is the kind of story we're hearing in the classroom. And while that may sound extreme, different, slightly less extreme versions of these stories circulate through literature, culture, soap operas, everything. The story of what happens when a girl speaks out, or the shame, how terrible it would be to live with the shame of of an assault of some kind. So these are very powerful stories, but I think what's worse is the self-blaming stories. And then I come back to my thing about the stories we tell ourselves, the self-blaming stories that may lead us as survivors to repeatedly feel that pain and that shame as we tell ourselves, this is something I must confess. But to whom can I confess? And that suggests that this was a sin of mine own. So, yeah, that's it. Education is hugely, hugely important in allowing people to see potential different futures than the ones that may seem automatic to them.
And so if we think about the way education maybe could go alternatively, as we hear that traumatic experiences seem to be, if not growing, then at least becoming more visible to a certain extent, and they're the way they pervade across young people's lives in various ways today. Um, would there be ways that you could see education as integrating more research or more insights from the kinds of work you do within trauma studies or with autobiographical writing? Are there ways that education could be more of a space in which trauma is acknowledged and held and responded to?
Absolutely. I think that there has been a kind of move, not only in classrooms, but obviously I'm a teacher myself, but not only in classrooms, but also in the education sector more generally, to allow people to self-identify um, as various in various ways to support their educational structures. So whether it's something like dyslexia, and then a person needs certain kinds of support is available to them if they're able to declare that. But then we also have people who will identify with particular mental illness issues, so things around depression or anxiety, all of these kinds of things. So these things get put into the front of what the teacher may see and know about the student. But also, I worry about it's not that those things are not important, but the codification of the identity of one as the victim of X, whatever the X might be, as one's identity, especially at a young age. Um, I wonder how much thought is put into what is that telling the student about themselves and their own potential. So again, in terms of teaching, I think if education were focused, if there could be a time each week in class where students thought about the stories they're telling themselves that week about themselves, whether it's that I'm so stupid, and that's why I did badly on that test, or, I'm ugly and that's why no one's talking to me, or whatever. Children can be horrible well, even adults can be horrible to themselves and things they say to themselves. To have that moment of thinking about what are the stories they're telling and how useful is it to them. So that a student who maybe, I used the example of being dyslexic before, that they may be aware that they're dyslexic, but being dyslexic may also offer them other ways of looking at things that can be useful and helpful and original and wonderful. So there are other stories beyond, that people can link to their identity. It's not only negative ones. So to be aware of the negative and the positive stories, if there is a way of building that into, I think that would be, life-changing for many people.
Meg, we're nearing the end, and thank you so much for staying with us. I'm curious, and I'm sure Emma is. Where is your research taking you next? Could you tell us about your upcoming book on grief work as a auto theory, sisterhood, suicide, and art? What themes are you exploring there?
So in this, it's an auto-theoretical book that braids together memoir, literary criticism, art criticism, trauma studies, many different strands of my own, of my life, of myself, of who I am. Um, it moves back and forth between sort of psychiatric wards, funeral homes, art galleries, classrooms. It brings together the work of Virginia Woolf and Vladimir Nabokov and Lord Byron, so all these literary figures. But really, it's an exploration and a negotiation of my relationship with my sister Mary, who committed suicide 15 years ago, and how that relationship developed as children, and how it's gone on since her passing, because she continues to be a presence in my life. So I think, um, as we were talking about earlier, my own writing. So it's a memoir, but it's a memoir with bits left out, and a memoir with spaces and moments where I'm stopping and thinking about what is the relationship between what I do for a living and how I live. Um, does it matter that I know all this about trauma if when I'm going through a traumatic situation of my own? Does that help me, or is it actually less helpful to be that aware of what's going on? I think my own writing is very much framed not as a resolution of difficulties, but again as a negotiation. It's a sort of an opening up and looking at the processes. So trying to look at my own life with curiosity, I hope also with compassion, and perhaps compassion that I didn't have for myself at the time I was undergoing some of these experiences. So being able to see the world uh, as otherwise, something like that. Um, yeah, and thinking about potential uh, stories moving forward. What can the next story be? So it's bringing together um, much of my research alongside my own stories, and seeing where those things kind of braid and fall apart.
That sounds amazing. And I think that work is something that we should all aim to do really when we're writing and researching, and bringing that into our lives and asking us questions about how much what we're writing or reading or working on is connected with the lives that we're leading. Um, our last question brings us back to the aims of our podcast as a whole. If writing is not a solution but a question, then what is for you the most urgent question that we should be asking about trauma, autobiography, and writing?
So I think in keeping with a lot of what I've said today, the questions around what are the stories are we that we're telling ourselves about ourselves? What are the stories we're telling ourselves about violence towards women? That this is just something that happens all the time. There's nothing we can do about it. Is that the story we're telling? Or is the story we're telling that this is, the single most urgent human rights crisis of our time is, violence against women? Um, what story are we telling ourselves about how we respond to that violence, about how it is overcome or let go? Are those stories useful? Are they supporting us? Um, and again, that step of questioning the accepted version of events, especially within one's own life story. Almost, every woman in the world has experienced physical or verbal violence, or certainly witnessed acts of violence. This is a common occurrence. It just is being a woman in the world. Unfortunately, even if you don't have that happen to you, you're aware that at any moment it could. So the continual presence of that violence in our lives, to think about the stories we're telling ourselves and our children about that violence and what can be done about it.
Thanks so much, Meg.
Thank you, Meg.